hope that you can hear me on the web.
Yes, thank you.
Wonderful. So I'm Mike Small. I spent most of my career developing software. When I retired, I moved to the dark side and became an analyst so that I could criticize what the people created rather than producing it. And what took my interest was the cloud, because having developed so much software that then sat the CDs on shelves, the notion that somebody would install it and make it work seemed very plausible to me. However, certainly for the last 15 years, I've been researching the security and compliance implications of using the cloud. And at the very beginning, one of the things that I talked about was dependence and the business continuity risk that using the cloud posed. And indeed, very soon, this research was rewarded by a cloud provider that was producing a limited service that was used by hospitals, and it went bankrupt. And there was this unseemly example of administrators contacting hospitals and saying, if you don't pay us so many £1,000 by Friday afternoon, 5 p.m, all your data will be gone and everything will be gone. Now, so that was 15 years ago. I wonder if anybody noticed that. I woke up and I'm a Lloyds Bank customer and I couldn't use the app. And then I discovered this was all down to basically a butterfly that had flapped its wings somewhere in the east coast of the US. And this had led to a failure, catastrophic failure across AWS. Now, that is not to say that AWS doesn't take a lot of trouble to try and make their services reliable. They do. But what it brought home to me, when you looked at the number of organizations that had been impacted by this, was it became obvious how dependent we have become upon the cloud. Now, when I was a boy, which was a long time ago, domestic resilience of the nation depended upon electricity, the gas supply, water, and what was the old post office that ran communications. And if you'd secured all of those, then you had a country that was resilient. Now, what has happened is that the whole of industry has become dependent upon the use of cloud services. And those cloud services are not even, for the vast majority, delivered from what are our close neighbours or even within the UK. They are delivered from foreign jurisdictions that today may be our friend, but may at some point in the future become our enemy. So it seems to me that this is a lesson that we need to learn. And this lesson is in part about cloud, it's in part about sovereignty, but from our perspective of IT professionals, it's really about cyber resilience. So what I would simply say is, in terms of the lessons that we need to learn from that whether or not you like it, the US delivered and the US owned cloud is part of our critical infrastructure. And I say European because I work for a German company, and this is a major problem across the whole of the EU. Now, from the perspective of the majority of people, the majority of organizations, those are the primary lessons that I think we need to take. But part of that, there's also a second dimension to this, which is to do with the politics. So we can only ourselves and our organizations manage with what we actually have and we have to work with. But there is also a political dimension, which really is something that needs to be thought through as to whether or not we as a political entity want to be wholly dependent upon things delivered from third-party countries or third countries. So that is really what I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to focus on what you can do as an organization. And perhaps at some other point, we'll get some input from politicians about this. Or as Ronald Reagan said, the worst sentence you can hear is, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help you." So this is the size of the problem. That if you look at the market for cloud services in the EU, and it kind of includes the UK because these are American statistics, that it's $70 billion. And of that, only 70% of it comes, only 70% comes from US clouds. So effectively, this is a market which is dominated by US-based cloud service providers. And we'll talk about the implications of that as we go into this. And by the way, I'm hoping that as we go on, you will heckle me and ask questions. So if we look at that, why is that? Now, as I say, I work for a German company, and I've given this in Germany. And the question that I then pose to the audience is, why do Americans buy German cars? And you might say, well, why have I asked that question? And if you listen to President Trump talks about European cars as being something that is putting American jobs at risk, because Americans want to buy Fords. No, they don't want to buy Fords. They want to buy Volkswagens. They want to buy Daimlers. And so why is it that Americans buy German cars? And I usually say to a German audience, did any of you come here in a Humvee? And the reason is, of course, that at German cars, people choose what they think is best and most appropriate for their particular circumstances. And that German cars are really quite good. They're very efficient, they're very reliable, and so on. And what we're talking about is this amazing notion of free trade. And the idea of free trade is basically that individuals can focus on, and countries can focus on, and organizations can focus on what it is that they do best. And they sell those things to other people who do other things best. And between all of this, there is a proper flow. And that's all very well until somebody comes along and says, well, actually, I don't like the way free trade is working, and I'm going to do something. And so, if you will, one of the things that has brought all of this to the fore is the protectionism and the trade wars and the pronouncements from the US about unilaterally applying tariffs. Now, we can, like I say, this is US president can do what the US president can do, but we have to be able to work within that environment. So what does that mean? Why do people choose US-based clouds? Well, basically, because the better. And if you look at the 6 reasons that I put there, the first thing is that they actually have an amazing ecosystem that has developed around them. They have integrated services, they have marketplaces with lots of people who hook onto it, and therefore you've got a much richer offering that, because they have money and because of the way venture capital works and because of the way the US economy works, they've actually been able to put large amounts of money into innovation, and largely speaking, they are ahead of European things. Because of the global scale, they have inherent advantages of scalability and reliability. I mean, it is amazing. I went to a reInvent a couple of years ago, and what would you think would be talked about at an AWS event? They had people on the stage who said, our job is to put fiber optic networks across the world. AWS is developing and laying networks. They had other groups of people who said, well, when we build a data center, we don't assume that there's going to be power. So we have a whole branch that is concerned with nothing else other than building the electric power supplies that are needed by the AWS data centers. Now, once something is succeeding like that, then if you want a job in IT, pretty good thing to do to go and get yourself certified as a practitioner for one of these big cloud providers. It's much better than being certified for something that's a much smaller thing, because you've got more job opportunities. That the result of the domination is that they've also figured out how to integrate with the conventional on-premises and mainframe enterprise IT systems. And that, on top of that, has been a lack of, if you will, some kind of sensible strategy to, if you will, to find a way to home grow something that's better, because the EU Gaia initiative and so forth has not really produced anything. So if you want some proof points of that, here is a, yes.
Apologies for interrupting your flow. Are you sharing the slides after?
Yes, yes, sorry. You just wanted to know if we said.
I did. And also, do you mind if we take photos of slide material?
Yes, you can take photos of them, but I will, they will be shared as a PDF.
They'll be part of it.
So I did a very quick count of the number of services that are available on the major US cloud providers, and they're all 150 plus services. And I picked out one because there is a very large European cloud. I mean, has anybody heard of OVH? OVH cloud? Yeah. Well, and that is an excellent cloud service with data centers in Paris and in the US as well. And in comparison, they have like 40 services. Well, they had when I did the research. So that is, if you will, an analyst proof point, anecdotally, of this problem of richness that there is there. And this is the traditional challenge of markets, that people who get dominant they get the revenue in order to invest. So, well, what are the threats? We've seen at the very beginning that we have become dependent upon it. And it's interesting that 5 to 10 years ago, what people perceived as the threats from this were all to do with data. there was our good friend, Dr. Maximilian Schrems, who was constantly suing Facebook over their use of his data. And this led to GDPR, our famous friend. And indeed, it only seems yesterday that I was in the old offices talking to an event on the BCS on how organizations were going to prepare themselves for GDPR. But it's much more than simply the question of the privacy of personal data. Because fundamentally, the US law, which was dissected forensically by Dr. Maximilian Schrems, basically says that in the US law is in fact supreme. And whatever they say about what they're going to do with your data, the US as government can override any contracts. So contract law is not necessarily going to protect you. And so you have this opportunity that they could not only steal your personal data, but that also implies intellectual property or other kinds of things. Then, yes.
And that would apply to assets outside of the US, as I understand it.
Yes. Well, this is the argument. I'm not a lawyer, but if you listen to the lawyers would say, if you have a US owned subsidiary in a third country, then if the US law is supreme over that subsidiary, that is basically the point. Now, when I was a doctor, I worked for an American company. And one of the things that we had to do was, my responsibility was to make sure that our software complied with the US export laws. And that included not including certain things like encryption. But it was also that it had to be able to be disabled if in fact we fell out with the country that was using it. And indeed, there are various examples that have been brought up in pieces of military equipment and so forth, where if you buy US military equipment, then the US has the means to prevent that from being used against them, i.e. there is a kill switch. And so one of the potential concerns is that your software, your service that you depend upon could in fact be terminated because there was a fallout between the US and your country. And then one of the things that has happened is that going back to this business of what does the society depend upon, if we now depend upon IT services, cloud IT services, and that's absolutely part of our social fabric, then we've lost a degree of autonomy. And at a country level, we've effectively put ourselves in a position where we could be ransomed or hijacked or held to ransom by a foreign power. Now, those are all theoretical at the moment, but what the Amazon outage showed was the kind of potential impact of a friendly service that is in fact particularly well managed going down. So if you translate this, I believe there are 4 major risks, and many of these in fact relate to data. But if you look at the thing from the perspective of sovereignty, that is to say, where does the law apply and what control do you have over that law? The first thing is data sovereignty. And this is, if you will, where is the data held and who could access it? So if you store the data outside of your jurisdictional boundaries, then it can be accessed against your will and against your local laws. So that is this risk of unauthorized access. That is related to operational sovereignty, because we all know, we're IT professionals, and we all know that if you are an administrator of these systems, then administrative access often gives you privileged access to things that you would not normally have access to. Now, there are various technical controls around that, but nevertheless, this is one of the concerns, and this is the kind of thing that you were raising, where if you had your data held in Germany on a cloud service that had a control plane that took it into the US, a US-based administrator could be subject to a legal access request, which says to that administrator, you must provide me with a copy of the data that is held in Germany. So this is a risk of legal but unauthorized access. Then there is technology sovereignty. And here is the challenge, which is that we have become dependent upon particular technology stacks. And if that technology stack is owned by someone else, then that someone else can withdraw the license for you to use it. So you could potentially find yourself in a position where even if you have the software, you couldn't use it. And like one of my friends said, try using an Oracle database in Russia. You won't be able to. So again, you have the risk. The dependence upon this foreign technology stack means that you could lose access to it. And then there is the question of the sovereignty of the infrastructure. Where is it? And who has access to it and who controls access to it? So there are those four major risks that we need to talk about. And hopefully I'm going to talk about what we can do about them. So when you look at those four risks, we can come up with some of the actions that we could take as an organization, as opposed to as a country and a political entity. That what you can do is you can say, well, I'm only going to store my data in certain regions, because you hope that if you're in that region, the data will be subject to that. You can encrypt the data so that if it is illegitimately accessed, then it would not be accessible. And there are other techniques which we will talk about. But basically, these are, perhaps you could get hold of a copy of the infrastructure and you could run it independently, i.e. an appliance, or you could make sure that you back your data up.
Sorry, just picking up your point on data encryption. That's a really interesting one, because a lot of the cloud providers provide you with key management services. So you might be encrypting your data in their cloud, but then using their service to generate the keys. So that feels like it's a very helpful thing to provide, but actually you're giving the keys to the kingdom to the provider and anyway.
Yeah,
regardless.
that's absolutely right. And I think that's a very important point, that there is encryption and there is encryption. That encryption is useful against a certain set of risks. So if, for example, the cloud provider somehow or other lost the physical media, then that would be helpful to protect against it. But it is not helpful against the risk of the cloud provider being served a legal writ that says, give us the data. So it's a question of what does it do? So that's one of the things. Now, operational sovereignty, again, is something that you should be able to control with operational sovereignty. And I'm going to, again, expand on what some of the cloud providers say about this. But so this is the question that the gentleman here was raising, which is, if you have a German employee working in a data center in Germany for a US customer, can the US demand that the German employee reveals the data? And this is the kind of conundrum that I'm sure lawyers will spend a lot of time turning over. But these are the kinds of things that people are concerned about. So it isn't simply a question of where is the operator, but what laws do they apply to them? What citizenship do they have? Can you put in place access controls that would prevent that kind of thing? And so forth. And some of the cloud providers will say they're doing that. And then there is the question of physical ownership. So if in fact you're using something that is owned by someone else, can that someone else prevent you from accessing it? So if the American company owns the infrastructure that provides your cloud in Germany, does that mean that they could deny you access to it because we own it and you're not allowed to use it? And technology sovereignty, ultimately, this comes back to standards, probably are the most powerful thing that you can do to protect you against that. But in fact, a lot of the stuff is now very, very bespoke. That, again, going back to our French cloud service provider, they will tell you that in order to make their cloud run, they actually get their own chips, which they put on their own motherboards, and they package them in their own way in order to be able to pack them closely enough. So you might think, you know, an Intel or a chip is an Intel chip wherever it is. But in fact, each of these cloud service providers have their own very bespoke way of making the things work. And that is far more than just saying it's just Linux on an Intel server. So open source. So, and then you might say, well, what can we do? We can do something about contracts. Well, contracts are really the backstop. And for the most part, organizations have very little control over the contract that cloud service providers write. It is only as a result of political intervention and things like GDPR that the cloud service providers now have standard forms of contract for use in Europe because they were forced to put certain things into it. But again, if you read some of these contracts, they certainly do not give you the kind of recourse that you might want against total denial of service. So, in effect, one of the most important things is, and again, this is really to do with being able to manage as an organization. And I would say that standards are your biggest friend. More that you can use that is standard, the better. And the good thing is that a lot of the way that people are using clouds is in fact increasingly based on standards. So the modern application is written using microservices, and it's written through and uses an orchestration system called Kubernetes. And there are standards for what one of these containers looks like, called OCI, and the way that you can define the software-defined infrastructure can be done through what are de facto standards like Terraform. And so there are a lot of things that you can do to make yourself more independent. Now, does that actually allow you to move cloud? Not really. It helps because you can say, well, I've got this Kubernetes app, I'm going to run it here or run it on AWS, or I'm going to run it on Google. Once you've gone beyond those standards, everything to do with managing that cloud, the whole of the management APIs, the whole of the management tools, while they're doing the same thing, they're different. So what effectively happens is that you become locked in through optimization and management rather than through the stack that you wrote the thing upon. And so what do you do? Well, there isn't a simple answer. In terms of security, this has led to the growth of a market called Cloud Native Application Protection Platforms, CNAP, which effectively is a way of saying that we've got a set of tools that will do the same things on different cloud providers' services in the same way. So you have a common user interface, a common set of APIs, a common way of reporting. Now, that perhaps works for security, but from a point of view of a wrapper, to manage things, can you put a wrap around it? Well, not really very well. So you're left with this residual risk that whilst you can develop your software and develop your systems in a way that is reasonably independent, then when it comes to actually running it, the optimization is dependent upon proprietary things. And by the way, I've not talked about software as a service. Those of you that are still awake, you know, what about your ERP system? What about your CRM system data? What about all your office systems data, your emails, your PowerPoints and so forth? And all of those are very proprietary, and moving between one and another is by no means easy. Now, just so we don't forget where we are, the point about all of this is not only that the Americans are stealing our lunch, it's also that if something happens, how resilient are you? And resilience really means, what could you do? It's, you know, in a sense, there's a difference between high availability and resilience. And resilience is what you lose when you get old, like me. When you're young, you fall down, you bounce, and you get up. When the cloud service goes down, how quickly can you bounce back? And we've seen some examples over the past week, and it was very interesting that there was, I think it was in the Times, or maybe it was on the BBC, there was a chap from Jaguar Land Rover who was saying they thought they'd done very well to be able to get everything back and running in 6 weeks. And that probably was true. They did do well. But we've moved from a world where we've moved to a world which is optimized and everything is just in time. And this just in time model is actually very fragile. At the physical level, we no longer build things and put them in a warehouse and then use them to assemble them. We do everything in the most optimal way. You only make it when it's needed and you ship it as soon as it's made and it's assembled and put together, and that's across the board. So what are the three critical considerations? And this is what I believe are the things that you need to look at. And I've been writing a series of blogs on this very question, and you can find them on the KuppingerCole website. And it's interesting that over the past 12 months, I have had all of the major cloud service providers begging me to come and listen to what they've got to say about how they are dealing with our concerns about resilience and sovereignty. And so when we look at what they're saying, one of the things that you find, they've now come up with this concept of what they call a data boundary. So you can, in fact, it was only last week in Munich that Google had a big conference. They announced $5 billion worth or 5 billion euros worth of investment in Munich in data centers there. And part of their story, which is also the story from Microsoft and from the other providers like AWS, that the idea of a data boundary is solving some of the problems that you had said, which is that we, the cloud service provider, will not only have a data center that is located in Germany, but we will put in a technical control, which means that the control plane that is used for that cannot access from outside of Germany or outside of the EU. So that if you have data centers in the EU, they cannot be accessed for administrative purposes, or at least the data cannot be accessed from outside of the EU. And so that is the cloud server's answer to part of this problem. So you say, oh, well, that's fine, but what if you had German employee or US employees in Germany? Well, so then your next question, they'll say, and they have different answers to this, is what they are starting to do is to create EU or local legal entities, and it is that legal entity that delivers your service in that environment. And that entity is staffed and has a board of directors that is of European or local citizens, and they are subject to local laws and all the local laws that would be related to having a company in there. So that is Microsoft's approach and also IBM's approach. In terms of Google have gone down a different route, and Google have gone into partnership. So in France, they have a partner called S3NS, and in Germany, they have a partner called Stackit. And what they've basically done is they have said, we will give you the Google Cloud Stack, and you can implement that in your data center, and you can then deliver that service within the geographical boundary as a completely independent thing, which does not need a connection to the US services at all. And that is targeted on government services. So S3NS is SecNum certified in France. And the Stackit one will become what is the German equivalent. So that is in part what I'm calling an air gap. So but Google now, certainly for some time, AWS had an appliance, and so did Microsoft. They had an appliance that you could buy that was preloaded with the cloud. And so you could take a cloud with whatever it had to offer, and you could put it wherever you wanted, and you could run it. And that was originally intended for something to run in places with poor connectivity, like on a ship or in the middle of a desert when you were drilling for oil or something. But in a sense, that has been rebadged to deal with concerns about the availability of things. And finally, they then, in fact, actually, there is another step with that, which is, well, it's this actually, I'm sorry. So they're talking now about openness, and Google in particular has been saying, well, we are going to be open in Europe, and we're going to effectively permit a local cloud service provider, like the ones we've already nominated, to use our technology stack and deliver a local version of that cloud service. They also claim that they support open standards, and to some extent, that is true. They do, in the sense that a lot of the things that they develop, they release, but the actual intellectual property that allows it all to run so efficiently is still their stock in trade. So those are the things that you should be looking for, and those are the things that the cloud service providers are giving you. Don't forget data backup. And it was very interesting because yesterday, this guy from Stackit was talking about the importance of backup. And he was talking about being able to make sure that he could restore his cloud stack. But from you as an organization that's trying to use this, it is tempting to think that because it's in the cloud, you don't need to take backups. But in fact, you do. Not only for the obvious things that you may destroy the data yourself by mistake, but also as a potential way around to give you some degree of resilience. So you obviously have to take copies of your business data, and that's, if you will, unsaid. But one of the things that is often forgotten is that as the cloud is in fact data, then the infrastructure as code is what it is that makes that cloud run. And if you then wind that back a bit and look at a modern DevOps environment with rapid change, that it's not just a question of taking a snapshot of the data. You need to take a continuously updated snapshot of the structure of the delivery of that thing, including the load balancers, the servers, the database servers, and everything else which is described in data. And then hopefully you can bring it back. So can you put that back up in a cloud? Because that's where everybody ends up putting them. And if you put it in the same cloud, then you might find yourself in some difficulty if that cloud service were to go down. And there is an example of one that did. There was a data center fire, and as a result of the fire, a lot of organizations were unable to access their data for some time. So the final thing that I'm talking about is protecting data. And you were talking about encryption a little while ago. And so if you look at the technologies that you have available to you, then there's a lot of interesting stuff around that may help or may not help, depending upon how you look at it. And certainly the least effective from a generic point of view is relying on the cloud service encryption that is inbuilt, because that encryption is effectively under the control of the third party. So what should you do? Well, first of all, if you're going to encrypt it, then you should encrypt it in a way where you retain control of the keys, whatever it is that you're doing. And that is the first fundamental thing. And that's fine. Straightforward encryption works if all you're doing is putting static data, say backups, into the cloud. But if you have a dynamic environment, then some people that are totally paranoid think, well, while the data is being processed, it's actually being decrypted. And so potentially, if you could see that data whilst it was in processing, then you could steal it. So what can you do about that? And our friends in Europe wrote a very, very comprehensive document from the European Data Protection Board, which set out a set of advice on this. And top of the pops for that was EU-based pseudonymization, which is effectively, there are ways that you can make the data look like the kind of data that you expected it to be, but in fact, you've encrypted it in a way so that it can still be processed. And so that is pseudonymization as one of the approaches. The other approach is through trusted execution environments. So if you're running in the cloud and you believe that you can trust a hardware security module to keep your keys safe, then if you believe that that kind of technology is good, then you can build a processor where effectively the data is held in an enclave in a secured piece of hardware where it is decrypted in order to be processed, but is inaccessible other than by the processor whilst it is being processed. An interesting diversion on that is that AWS takes a slightly different approach, and they have their processors which they call Nitro. And the Nitro processor is one where effectively they have a separated control plane which is only able to access the administration of that chip needed for them to run the service. And that is separated in such a way that the administration actions can never see the data. What you have to do is, if that's a concern of yours, is you have to look at what there is and decide on what you can do. Now, some of these things work better than others under different circumstances. One of the interesting ones is Microsoft have double key encryption. Double key encryption, which is effectively, they encrypt the data anyway, but you are allowed on your endpoint to have an encryption key and an encryption. You can use this with Office 365. The good thing is it works, providing you are using the desktop apps. Obviously, if the data is encrypted in the cloud versions of the apps can't work. So you need to look at that quite carefully. Now, so what could you see in the EU? Well, I wrote a report And there are all these cloud providers in the EU. I wonder how many people have come across these. Anybody come across them? Because it's interesting that nobody's putting their hands up and saying, you thought about, you're using them, are you? You know that.
I've used 3 of those.
You've used 3.
Yes.
And what was your impression?
So they're not as capable as the American solutions. And I've also done systems which have been running in all 3 clouds. So I've been across all 3 of the major clouds. But the main impact is cost, in that you're probably looking, if you're running, let's say you're running across 2 clouds, you're probably looking at a 5x cost impact. And even if you look at a relatively basic service such as compute, it's not a like for like comparison. You're not actually comparing apples to apples, you're comparing apples to bananas. So the abstraction that you're dealing with is never quite the same. There's various UK financial regulations, many to sort of exit from a contractual point of view, called stressed exit. We've tried to build things, with previous clients where we've tried to build these stressed exit solutions, but the applications are so big. I always maintain that if you're not running sort of hot across multiple platforms, you won't be able to do it. It will take you a year to extract from a big system. And at that point, it's a risk management position rather than because it's so expensive that people just won't fund it.
Yeah.
I mean, I've used the I think it's with Google. They have, you can put your HSMs in their data centers, so you can sort of do customer managed encryption keys to handle that. But it becomes very expensive, and only the largest organisations are prepared to spend that money.
Yeah. Very interesting, yes. So I think I have listened to the large US cloud providers explaining how they get their bang for buck out of their infrastructure. And it is very clever what they do to give you, and you're absolutely right, that just because you have a compute service wouldn't necessarily mean it's comparable. And not only that, but a lot of things now are built on the goodness me, the name is gone, the non-compute service. You know what I mean?
So you sort of Lambda or container.
The Lambda,
solutions,
yes. And that is a different thing entirely to do with how they manage to optimize that within the stack. And basically, when you look at what is written there, that nearly everything is based on OpenStack. And if it isn't based on OpenStack, then it's VMware. And OpenStack, well, it's open source. And so that should theoretically give you some perspective of removal from the proprietary nature of things, but it isn't going to give you necessarily the same control.
No, and even if you tried to move between different cloud providers, Kubernetes implementations, they're all subtly different. And unless you're actively running, it's a hard migration. Even if you have a perfect sort of 12-factor app that conform to the various standards, it tends to limit your language choices. Not every runtime will one of those on the sort of runtimes that these cloud providers have. The best technology I've seen at the moment for sort of an on-prem equivalent would be Oxide Computing, but that's not available in the UK yet, and that's still not available outside the US, and that's another US company. So you've got a similar challenge there.
Yeah.
But they are building the equivalent technical stacks. They'll sell you a rack. So you will hopefully get some of the concentration and efficiency gain that the big cloud providers have.
Yeah, well, that's very interesting. That's very interesting as a perspective. So basically, these are the EU choices. And if you look, some of them have some success. And so SAP, or SAP, for example, is very popular with Germans because they all use SAP as the business software. And so when I've spoken to them about it, they would basically say, well, if you're using our SAP ERP or human resources or whatever, then it's a good choice. But if you just want to use it, then it probably isn't as good a choice. And the same is kind of true of Oracle. Oracle have their OCI. And if you're a big Oracle user using their ERP and whatnot, then it probably makes sense because you'll get a good deal. But apart from that, they all have clouds. They all work, but they aren't of anything like the scale. So where are we? So this is kind of the end. So we started off worrying. When I started to research the cloud, people were worried about using the cloud because they didn't want to devolve their security to the cloud. Now, in fact, most cloud service providers do a much better job of securing the infrastructure than most small businesses. Then it became a question of we're worried about compliance, and that was particularly a concern with data and GDPR. And now we have moved on to another era, which is we have become, as a society, extremely dependent upon IT delivered services for everything to work. And I mean everything. And more of those services are now delivered based upon infrastructure and services that are provided from outside of our geographical and jurisdictional boundaries. And that leads to an issue to do with cyber resilience. And cyber resilience is becoming effectively societal resilience. And so what can you do about it? And it isn't, although people talk about sovereignty as being a solution, it would be nice if we could have it all together in the UK or in the EU. But the honest facts of the matter are that we don't have anything that squares up to what the US can provide. Now, in a world of open free trade, we wouldn't be worried because we will produce something that they want and we'll consume their cloud services. But when the problems occur where certain members of the international community start to become protectionist, that causes a problem for us to look at. So if you look at the things I've talked about, the US clouds are too good to turn your back on. The US cloud service providers are making moves towards resolving some of the concerns, at least within the EU. And they're doing that by several methods which I've described, which are to do with creating local legal entities, working with partners, making their infrastructure available, and creating boundaries around what is there. Now, if you don't like that, you have a choice. So either not use the cloud, or you can try and use one of the local clouds. And they have, this is a simple risk, reward, cost judgment. And so problem is that the local clouds don't have the functionality. So this is really as good as you can say a risk management problem that that you have to take account of. So with that, I'm going to say thank you very much for your time. And if there's any questions, then I'm going to.
Lovely, thank you, Mike. Any questions? Box, you were going to look at the online questions, see if there's any there. If there's any questions here in the room, we're taking together. So are there any questions online?
There are a lot of comments, and there is quite some comments about the privacy and what's happening with the GDPR in Europe. It's quite scary what has been leaked from a German letter, apparently. There are a few questions about, is it time to have our own cloud, which makes me laugh because that's just somebody else's computer, isn't it? Sorry, I'm just trying to get the actual questions.
I've got a question to fill in, Mike, and that's it's one that is a fairly simple question. It's about the duration of cloud contracts, or the duration that cloud service providers give commitments to their customers. Because my observation has been that most customers have data retention and application lifecycle requirements that are significantly longer than anything that the cloud service providers are willing to commit to. They typically commit to rolling 1-month contracts, perhaps a 12-month contract, but perhaps a 24, but they don't really give any long-term commitments. So I find it surprising that so many customers are willing to put their data into an asymmetric relationship where the cloud service provider says, oh yeah, thank you very much for agreeing to be my tenant for a period of time, and I'll give you a short-term tenancy, but they're not actually giving the customers a long-term tenancy or an agreement to keep doing the same thing for the lifetime of the data or the application. So why does anybody put their data into an arrangement where they can foresee that they haven't actually got the commitment from the provider to the required duration?
Well, I think that's a good question, and different industries have different data retention requirements. I mean, particularly medical and pharmaceutical, where you have to keep it for decades. And so I think that this is to do with a risk, and that there may be a risk to do with losing your data over the long term, but there are other ways that you can store that data other than in the cloud service provider. So if you have to retain data for long periods, then maybe you have to put that data for retention into other systems, and there are data archive providers which will do that kind of thing for you.
I suppose I was thinking about it more just in terms of applications, because it's not normally just a matter of the data, but access to data. So if you need an application to access the data, I mean, I work in financial services, and typically, EU anti-money laundering, you have to retain data for 5 years after the end of a customer relationship. And if that's a mortgage, it could be a long loan, 25-year loan, or 40-year loans are quite common in Europe. So you've got data, you've got to keep the data accessible for decades, and you're looking at cloud service providers offering you a year or two. It's like, why do people move the data into a position from which it's more difficult to deal with the life cycle than if you hadn't moved it into a proprietary vendor environment?
I'll answer. I know a lot of the big financial services will have 5 or 10-year contracts with the big cloud providers, and trust me, there's an army of lawyers on both sides negotiating that, and there'll be massive deals. And if you Google any of the big banks and a cloud provider, you'll see those things get announced to the press, and they're in their financial statements and end of year reports. So there are much longer contracts out there than just a couple of years.
Yeah, and I think the point that you made there is that it's to do with the size of the organization. that if you or I or a small business rocks up, you are only going to get the standard cloud issued service contract. Cloud providers want these big businesses to use them, and they will go out of their way to do it. So, for example, again, in the financial services, there is often a fiduciary responsibility to inspect and say that the services are running correctly. And in general, cloud service providers will not allow you to do an audit of their service. But they have ways of allowing those kinds of requirements to be met in order to do with getting the kind of size of business that represents.
There is a trend now for people sort of repatriating to on-prem computes. I think Basecamp and DHH, the founder of Ruby on Rails, is very vocal on this. There's a great series of blog posts he's put up with numbers. And so he's been running that business for 20 years using the cloud, but I think they finally exited this year. And he did it on financial reasons. You know, he said it was cheaper for him to run on-prem on his own kit. So there are, for smaller organizations, there are viable options if you're not using every single feature that AWS provides you. You know, if you've got a more simple system.
And along that line, it is interesting that if you look at what the cloud services are selling today, it is AI. And one of the things about AI is the amount of computing power that it uses, which is hard for small businesses to put up themselves. So in a sense, it's interesting that they want you to use AI.
Well, I would argue they're not selling AI; they're subsidizing it massively, because the value chain for most IT businesses is at the top of the stack. It's the mobile phone app. It's not in the computes, because you have a ratio of tens of thousands of users touching one computer. With AI, that'll be inverse. You have to have the computer to run the models, to do the inference, to do the calculations. So I don't think it'll be the same. And then you'll be captive because you've used the AI, and then they'll be able to put the prices up, and you'll pay the true value for that code assistance.
Yes. So are there any other questions?
There's some comments that one of the comments from Bruce was that when you mentioned about geopolitical threat landscape, that the AWS European Sovereign Cloud is happening at the moment to counteract the risk. Are you aware of the AWS European Sovereign Cloud?
Oh, yes. So in an earlier slide, I talked about some of the essential points that these big vendors are making in order to reassure things. And this can be Microsoft will say they have a sovereign cloud. IBM say they have a sovereign cloud. AWS say they have one. And Google was making big announcements in Munich last week about that. In essence, the sovereign cloud consists of having data centers in Europe, having some kind of a boundary, which is a technological control around data centers that stops administrators from outside of that boundary from accessing the data, and from having EU or local organizations that are actually delivering that service, so that they are completely autonomous of US legislation, and they are subject to local jurisdictional control. And so whether it's AWS, whether it's Microsoft, or whether it's Google, they have different exact flavors of that, but those are the essential points.
Thank you. I think it begs the question of why were the HMRC links to the US AWS a problem then when it crashed, or rather when it was not crashed, taken offline. But sorry, that was a flippant remark from me. I'm looking for the questions in the chat. So I mentioned that somebody, Tim, you were talking about Max Schrems and the NOIB in the chat. So thank you for that information. It's not really a question in there. There are other, what's the other thing that I saw? Yes. So are you aware, David picked up on this and he read a news article recently about putting data centers in space. What's your opinion on that one?
Well, I think you need to talk to a lawyer about that.
Thank you. And another comment about contracts, assuming that everybody obeys the rule of law on those. And David also mentioned there's a data bunker not far from where he lives. It's an old radar station. I know there has been mention of going to Wales as well, because apparently they have a lot of clouds there for everyone. Again, not really questions, more comments.
We have a question here in the room. Yeah.
So you said, I'm not from the industry, I'm very academic, so this might be a bit of a stupid question. So you said in Europe you have like AWS, their own clouds set up now. But we are still depending on the updates and patches and all that, isn't it? So it's basically there's no kind of an air gap type of thing. So we are still dependent on AWS. So okay, you said we have our sovereign clouds, in, say for an example, AWS. So we create our own clouds, and we maintain everything in Europe, say UK. But still, we have to depend on the main company for patches and updates. Yeah. There's no kind of air gap there, so we have to basically. So at some point, they can stop that service.
So the question is to do with that even if you have a US-based European sovereign cloud delivered by a European organization in European data centers, that would depend upon patches and updates coming from the US. And so if those patches and updates dried up, you would in fact stop, they could stop the cloud. Now, the interesting point about that is that Microsoft's answer to that is that they have said they will put the source of their cloud in what is called escrow. So that is held by an independent third party, so that if in fact relationships fell down, that the Europeans would still be able to get hold of that source code from this escrow. And then all they would have to do is to be able to understand it, to find the problem, to fix the problems, and to make the advancements. So I think the point about this is that there are lots of different dimensions that you could consider. And the interesting thing is that the pressure, the political pressure that came in particular from the EU has led to a lot of things that the US cloud providers 15 years ago told me they would never do. I remember talking to AWS and them saying, we don't need to put a data center in Germany. We've got one in Amsterdam. And they put a data center in Germany because the German market wants a data center in Germany. And so they are responsive to this $70 billion market and making sure that they can maintain it and they can do what they need to expand it. And part of the driving force behind the things that I've been talking about, like working with partners, revealing their stack, putting data boundaries round, is because those things were stopping them, or the lack of those things was stopping them from getting at certain kinds of customers in certain geographies. And so they want your money.
Okay.
Yeah.
We actually have 3 people here. Can I just say, can we just do 2 questions after that? Those that are here in London can network with Mike afterwards, because time is going on. So we've got the burning question, you two. So I'll let you go first, sir.
All right. I want to, first of all, I want to say thank you so much for the lecture. So my question is, do you think data retention will be a problem with, with the rate of AI in all these data storage vendors?
Data retention,
Yeah.
AI, quantum computing, there's all kinds of concerns about data retention.
Okay.
And you know, if you have to keep data for 50 years, I don't know if any of you remember floppy disks.
Yeah.
Well, the very media that we hold data on has changed so many times. You know, when I went into computing, we had magnetic tapes and we had certain kinds of disks. And now we have completely different storage media. So actually holding data for decades is a serious problem in itself. That if that data is confidential, how you can maintain the encryption of that data so that it is still as secure in 50 years' time as it is today against risks like quantum computing is one of the interesting things. Now, as the gentleman has said, that if you are a big enough organization and you have a regulatory requirement which would otherwise stop you from using the service, and you're big enough that they want your business, then they will give you some kinds of guarantees. But otherwise, if you have that requirement to keep it for a long time, you need to take care of how you do it. And that's more than just a cloud question.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll come to our last question before I call upon Fox to give a vote of thanks to you, Mike. So
Yeah, thank you. What would you say are the quick wins in reducing dependence on US technology?
Well, I think that we all need to think more about resilience, and that the world has changed. And as we have become more and more dependent upon IT services, all the organizations need to think of how we are going to manage when we can't access them, when something goes wrong. And I don't think it's just about the US, because you could say there's another big cloud which we haven't talked about called Alibaba, and whether or not we're friends with them. And you could also say that for most of my life, the computer systems and the computer chips and the systems that we depended upon have mostly come from outside of the UK and from the outside of Europe. And yet we've survived. So we've survived because of being careful and how we do things. So I think we need to think about how we become resilient. And that doesn't necessarily mean not using the US, but maybe being a bit more careful about how we do it.
that was a good question to finish up with.
Yeah.
It's going from computer record sheets to desktop input. For those of you that are old enough to remember computer record sheets. Anyway, I call upon Fox, if that's okay, Fox, to give a few words of thanks to Mike.
Certainly. Yes, thank you so much, Mike. That was really a very educated and thought-provoking presentation. And although there weren't that many questions that came out of chat, there's an awful lot of chat, and it has raised the our education levels and other things that we have to worry about.